Okay, this is Philip Dawson Jr. from Performance Golf Academy. We have the good fortune today of being here with Lauren Abarca, mental performance coach. Lauren's a good friend. She was a high-level collegiate soccer player and now works within the Yankees organization in Major League Baseball. And so today we're going to have a little back and forth, just asking some questions about high-level performance for golfers and some things that maybe all you guys had sent us some questions in on social media. And so we're going to see how this goes today. So Lauren, thanks for being here.
Awesome, I'm so excited.
Really appreciate it. So first of all, talk about a little bit being a mental performance coach. What exactly is that? So how would you describe your job?
Sure. No 2 days are the same. I mean, they're really like totally different. But what we do as mental performance coaches is we focus on, sports psychology, which is a little bit more of like a surface level psychology, I'd like to say. I like to call it more soft skills. So clinical psychology dives a little bit deeper, and it deals with stuff like depression, like clinical disorders, and that's not what I do. What I do is I work on things like confidence, anxiety, focus, all sorts of things like routines, motivation, all the things that can really affect performance when we're in it, and how we can prepare and actually even digest performance afterwards. So that's kind of the basis of what I do. It does go deeper into the personal side at times, but anything outside of my realm in terms of clinical or anything else, I actually refer out.
Okay, so how did you get into that? Like, was it just being an athlete got you interested in, or how did you kind of like go down that road, or what got you interested in being a performance coach?
I played soccer my whole life, like you had mentioned, and I fell in love with just the idea that, like, how can two people have the same talent and one person will make it and one person won't? Like, to me, that was the most fascinating thing. And so I actually wanted to go into physical therapy because I'm like, oh, sport, I get to work with athletes. And while I was in it, I realized I'm not really good at the medical side, number one. I didn't really like it, but I really loved my connection with my clients. And so to me, I was like, hey, how can I marry the two, where I can work with sports and I can still have the relationship with my clients? And that's kind of when I stumbled upon sports psychology, and I took a course in it and just completely fell in love with it.
That's great. Well, I know certainly, when I didn't make it in my chosen profession, which was a professional golfer, it was a big draw to coaching. It was, I think for my own self, wanted to maybe look into why I didn't make it, and I thought it was really cool so that, helping others and maybe helping them dodge some of the pitfalls that I fell into as an athlete when I was coming up, because we didn't have people like you when I was young, or even in college. People talk about the mental game and stuff like that, but I don't know that we really had tangible places to go to really help us with that stuff. So I think, as a coach, one thing that I see frequently, that I know on my social media anyway, that a bunch of people are curious about, and I think it's a very fine line training athletes, is, when you're working feel versus technique.
Right.
Obviously as a coach, you're giving people drills and you're showing them videos or TrackMan numbers, and you're trying to get them to do that. And then at the same time, to play at a high level out there on the course, we've got to be able to free that up and kind of play as an athlete. So what are maybe some things that you've seen work for you over the years as, kind of helping balance those two things when people are separating, say, more feel-based stuff or performance stuff from technique?
It's a really good question, and I think it's something that a lot of athletes and coaches struggle with, and not struggle with in a bad way, but and even we struggle with it. Like, how can we marry the two? Because practice is typically where all of the instruction comes in, right? And all the mechanical and technical aspects come in. And then when we perform, we're expected to then forget all the things we just practiced and just do it. Now, if you can consistently practice in technique only, then it's going to be really hard to translate that to performance. And so, like you said, it's important to kind of have the difference in the two. Now, feel, I like to, relate that to trust. Like, when you're working on feel, you're working on just like trusting what you do, trusting that feel, trusting what you've been practicing. And there's this interesting aspect of our memory that actually lends to that. So we have our short-term memory and our long-term memory. And our short-term memory is they describe it as like a Post-it note. And it can only hold as much as a Post-it note can. So just not that much. It's like little quick tidbits. Then as soon as our brain is done with that note, or we've completed the task, or another job comes along, that note gets thrown away. That's our short-term memory. And our long-term memory is something where we've practiced something over and over and over again. It gets logged in our long-term memory. Now, when people try to perform, I guess you'd say, or they're focused on feel and not technique per se, they're using their long-term memory. And so all those repetitions they put in before, that's what kind of comes out and helps you actually do the thing that you've practiced so many times. But that takes repetition. And so when you think of it like that, you want to do a little bit of both. You want to do some feel where you're focused on trusting and performing, and then you also want to do some technique, because that's what's going to get stored. And so when we're performing and when people say, oh, I'm in the flow state, they're talking about that long-term memory being engaged, because it's a subconscious thing. It's not something we're thinking about. We're a short-term memory where it's very conscious. So we're thinking about it. And when we think too much consciously, when we should be relying on our subconscious, it totally creates a barrier. And if you talk to people that say, oh, I feel overwhelmed, oh, I'm overthinking, or I didn't want to hit in the water, but now I did, well, that's because we're using too much of our like conscious thinking. And so that's kind of how our brain works in that sense. But and there's a lot of different techniques you can use to kind of get out of that. But if that explains, like, those are the two ways I kind of like to separate the two.
You know, I always look, for me, I look at students, and when they're playing, and I still play a lot myself, and I'll go caddy in tournaments and stuff. And what I really see the big separation is, you know, I've seen people play well thinking, but I've never seen anybody play great when they're really in that conscious state of like, oh, I've got to put the club here, or I've got to do this. You know, when you see people or elite athletes playing at the highest level, like back when I was playing, or watching some of the kids that are good players that I coach now, it seems that you can play around par golf, let's say, at a pro level when you're, working on a drill or putting a club in a position. But when you see someone who's shooting 7, 8, 9, 10 under, it looks so much more like they're just on an autonomous, they're going and they're just playing the sport and they're hitting different shots and stuff like that. So it's fascinating stuff to me, because I certainly spent too much of my career, which is probably why I'm a better teacher than a player, in that learning phase, you know, where I always felt like I was learning a new skill rather than I was using what I knew. And I can look back, I was telling Jim, who's helping us film, by the way, who was here earlier, that, you know, I spent the money to go work with someone like you when I was a tour pro, but the problem was implementing the information and changing my thought patterns. So what would you say, you know, day in and day out, people should be doing? You know, they come to see you and you say, hey, more positive self-talk, or hey, you got to get more into this autonomous phase when you play. What would you say are some things, or some daily things that someone might do to change their self-talk, or how they're going about, you know, changing a mental pattern that they've done a particular way for a long time?
Okay, that's a great question. And I think for every player, it's going to be different. And so depending on people I see, I have different techniques that I would use. But let's just take your example and say, like, there was some negative self-talk. You know, we're struggling to get out of this like negative framework. There's a few things that you can do. You know, elite level athletes do not focus on their feelings, they focus on action. And so young athletes, that's what I see happen a lot. And again, when we think about like high school level, okay, our brains aren't fully formed at that level. At that level, our prefrontal cortex is still growing, and our amygdala, where that is the emotional center of our brain, that is where we make a lot of our decisions, which, you know, when you make decisions emotionally, how great are they? Not great, right?
No, not in general for me anyway.
Yeah, no, same. And so when we think about it like that, a lot of our self-talk gets driven from that. And so the first thing I would say is focus on actions, not feelings. And you do that by asking yourself, what am I going to do now? Because a lot of times we'll look at our situation and say, well, this situation sucks. And it may very well. You know, I'm not asking you to lie to yourself. It's not like rainbows and unicorns, because that's not reality. But whatever your reality is, what are you going to do about it? What is the next action you're going to take? Putting that control back in yourself and not letting your situation control you, but you controlling your situation. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is, it's so easy, you know, like when you're in a crappy situation, to just focus on the crap. Like, I can't believe this is happening, and this sucks, and then I can't even do this, and I'm supposed to be doing this, and this person thinks this, and it becomes like a compounded effect. And so,
yeah, almost like you give energy to it and it grows even more.
Totally. And so I would say, like, don't let things compound. And start with, instead of focusing on what is not going well, focusing on what is going well. And if nothing's going well, then focus on the lesson you can get out of it. Because sometimes it's just like hard. It's like, you know what, there's not one thing I can think about that's going well. Okay, well then what lesson can you pull from it that you're going to be able to use in the future? And some of those things can just shift your mindset into focusing on what you can get out of it instead of what it got out of you.
Sure. I always find, especially coaching so many junior players, that you get much further asking them questions that lead them to answers than even telling them what to do, right? It's like I get kids all the time at tournaments and they'll be like, oh, coach, I'm playing so bad, or this or that, or I have all this anxiety about this course I'm playing. It's really tight off the tee. And I always just find it best to, okay, well, hey, what would be the first step on, hey, tomorrow you got to hit the first fairway. What's in your control that you can do to put you in a position to succeed in that moment? Walk me through maybe like that, like maybe the stages of like, hey, here's my routine and here's what I'm going to do from, say, strategy to planning, and then, going into performance, and then maybe what you might learn afterwards, like a post-shot routine kind of thing. So maybe as a golfer, because I know you work in a bunch of different sports, what do you like to see for a player on each shot like that, like kind of their as they walk through the routine?
So I guess, again, it goes back to like it's going to be different for every player. And so I would say your routine should be something that is, one, within your control. And so if you're thinking, okay, I have to hit it there. Well, is it in your control that you're going to hit it there? No, what's in your control is what you're going to do to try and get it there.
Sure.
So I'd say intention is important and purpose is important. And so a lot of times, when we go up with a certain purpose, that's, first of all, that's going to zero in your focus into, okay, what's my purpose of the shot? Then going back into getting yourself prepared for it. And so when we take a step back, then maybe for you, let's say that you get a lot of anxiety. You just start to your mind starts to wander. Okay, well then why don't you add a little breathing routine there? Breath is a great way to anchor your mind back in that present moment, because our mind is the only thing that can exist in the past, present, and the future. And so when our mind's too far in the past, like, oh, the shot I took just before this was terrible.
Sure.
Or the shot I'm about to take is really difficult. Well, then it affects our present moment and our ability to really focus in on what we're doing right here and right now. And so even using maybe an anchor to anchor yourself in that present moment, reevaluate, go over the things that you're trying to execute, and then get up and allow yourself to do it. And that's where that feel practice comes in, where
Sure.
getting up and trusting what you're doing. And that's not the easiest thing to do. And so I would say focus, like your routine should be something that's within your control, that has a purpose, and that is intentional to an outcome that you want.
I see all the time in sports in general, I'm sure you dealing with professional athletes, when adversity comes, like what's that next thing you're going to do, because the snowball's going crashing down the mountain, so to speak. And I've been in that situation many times as a player, or even just in, observing students playing or caddying. And this maybe just goes back to what we were just talking about, controlling what's in your control. But how can you recenter your mind in those adverse moments, before it just slips too far down the slope? What are maybe some tools that you've given some players when they are going through an adverse moment in a performance state, where you're out in the middle of a tournament or you're in the middle of a baseball game? What is something maybe you could do to refocus yourself? Obviously, breathing might be a huge one, but are there any other little tricks that you have that you think are important?
There's a couple that you can use. I would say when it comes to refocusing, first you want to know what's drawing your focus away, because you give power to what you focus on. So if we're focusing on something that's unhelpful or something that's super negative or an outcome that hasn't even happened yet,
Sure.
then we're going to give all of our power and our energy to that. And so by taking your energy back, we can focus on what you want to do right now in the moment. Now, the thing I love about breathing is that you can only do it in the present moment. And so you can use a physical cue, which would be something like our breathing, or maybe it's, when you put, you center your right foot and then your left, whatever. You can do something physical, you could do something mental. Maybe that's a mental cue, a word, a phrase that you really like.
Well, what I was going to say, something that's interestingly worked for me is sometimes I'll even challenge myself in that moment.
Right.
Almost chew myself out a little bit, come on, you got to kind of rise up in this moment. You don't have time to pout right now, or I'll almost have a little personal moment of talking myself through the adversity. So I think it's just the most fascinating thing in sports to me, momentum. You see it all the time. Sure.
I love that. I want to make a note about that, because things become compounding over time. And so when we make good decisions, whether that's what we eat, whether that's choosing to go to the gym, whether that's going to bed early and getting a good night's sleep, those things, every time we do something, we actually increase our chance of doing it again. And so it's a compounding effect. And the same happens with the negative. When we say, when we hit adversity, the tough thing is when I see players that aren't able to turn the page and let go. And they allow it to continue to compound. And they never take control back. They never I guess like utilize their mind to be able to like recenter, refocus, and then execute. And one of the things that we can do in terms of focusing is remembering like your purpose of being right there right now. Mm-hmm. And then instead of saying like, this is the situation I'm in, how did I get myself here? Well, what if I did that different? It's what am I going to do this point forward? And asking yourself again, what can you control in this moment? Because sometimes you might not be able to control your attitude. Maybe your attitude is just shit. That's
been there.
Yeah, you know, and you're just like,
you're having a bad day. You woke up on the wrong side of the bed and everything's going against you, and you're trying to manage it as best you can in the moment.
Yeah, so sometimes that's just not within your control right then. Sometimes you can't control your thoughts. Maybe your thoughts are just coming and you're just like, I just cannot control them right now. But maybe what you can control is your perspective. Okay, well, I know the situation I'm in right now isn't great, but I have 3 more holes, which is 3 more opportunities to get back, or at least end well. And so there are many different things that you can do, but I would say that trying to grasp control again. Mm-hmm. And it's not the easiest thing to do, but focus on what you can control right then.
Sure. Well, that's probably a good lead into, I think, a question that I know a bunch of people wanted me to ask you, which is, when someone starts to go low, right, lower than they're comfortable, let's call it that maybe, because I think everyone's version of that might be different. There might be a bogey golfer out there that their low is they've made 4 pars in a row, and then obviously a tour player might be 9 under in a tournament setting for the first time in their life. What are some things, and maybe this goes back to, I know, all these things kind of tie in together, but what do you see as the most important piece when you get in that moment where you're, as a tour pro, you're 9 under through 14, and maybe you have an outside chance at a 59 or something like that? What are some things maybe that someone could do to stay out of their own way, so to speak?
Well, and that is a thing that I've dealt with a lot of athletes that I work with, and it's getting like ahead of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's becoming this like catastrophe thinking of like, okay, what if I can't hold on to this? Mm-hmm. What if I'm not able to produce in this next hole? What if this guy does this? And what happens when we have that kind of thinking is that we are playing not to lose instead of playing to win.
Sure.
And so the other thing that we can focus on is consistency, because consistency over time compounds, and you're going to have highs, you're going to have lows. And I like to I guess explain it as like highs and lows are like this. And for maybe amateur performers, for professional performers, they still have highs and lows, but they look like this.
Sure.
And so it's being able to manage your consistency so that your highs aren't so high and your lows aren't so low. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you're going to ever erase them completely. So I would say the biggest thing is maintaining consistency through the good and the bad. A lot of times we fall into the trap of completely changing depending on how we feel. And that goes back to that feeling versus action.
Sure.
Is when we focus so much on how we feel and we let our feelings dictate our actions, that's where we get into trouble. When we feel like crap, suddenly we change something that maybe doesn't typically make us successful. So if you want to be frustrated, focus on all the things that make you frustrated. Focus on the fact that you didn't hit the putt the way you wanted to.
Sure.
Focus on the fact that the guy next to you, he just striped it down the middle, whatever that is. And then, sure, then you'll be frustrated. But if you want to be successful, you need to focus on the things that make you successful.
Right.
Not what the guy next to you, not the person on the other side. It's what it makes you successful, whether that's your mindset, and maybe for you, like you said, it's kind of challenging yourself a little bit.
Sure.
Maybe it's your approach. Maybe it's going back to the approach that you stayed consistent with up until then. But maintaining consistency throughout is one of the hardest things to do, but will give you the most consistent results.
Sure. What are your thoughts? I mean, that really leads me into something that I think I wish I would have done better when I was playing, and that's going to be a question in a second. What would you tell a young Lauren as an athlete, if you got to do this over again? But what are your thoughts on journaling? I look back on my own career, and I loosely journaled, I would say. I do it well for a while and then not, and hey, that's why I'm teaching again, by the way, or there's probably more reasons than that. But what are your thoughts on journaling and seeing patterns, when you're playing well and when you're not playing well? Do you find that beneficial for athletes?
I give it to almost all my athletes.
Sure.
And so it doesn't matter what level they're at, whether they're like elite professional athletes I work with, or even some of the lower athletes I work with. It's so important. And the thing that I wish you could just tell everybody, just do it, right? But some of the younger athletes, they just don't buy in right away. And to me, it's so, it's such an undervalued and underused tool. Because like journaling,
Right.
trust me, the more you know yourself, the more you're going to be able to adjust and adapt to a situation.
Sure.
The less you know yourself, the more question marks you're going to have to answer, which in the moment are really hard to answer when
Sure.
you're in a really tough situation. So what I do with all my athletes is, no matter, you can do it after practice and games. I do it no matter what, because again, the consistency piece, whether
Sure.
you're doing good or bad, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So is ask yourself these 3 questions. 1, what did you do well today? That is one of the things that gets lost, because when things are going really bad, it's so easy to focus on the negative, to focus on what you didn't do well and what you should have done and what you should have fixed. So what did you do well? Because no matter how bad you did, there's always something you did okay. 2, what can you do better? And a lot of people are like, well, what if I did really good? Well, you're never too good to continue to improve.
Sure.
And so constantly look at, what can I do better? And then the third one is, what did I learn from this experience? And sometimes that can be a hard one to answer, and I tell people like, hey, that's a bonus question. But if you can answer those 3 things after every practice or every game, you're going to be able to start to see patterns. Like, oh crap, every time this happens, I fall into this, and
Sure.
I need to do that better. Or, man, every time I'm in this situation, I do this really well. And so whether it's carving a roadmap for yourself, or whether it's highlighting the things you're really good at, you know, failure and success, they give us a pathway by showing us what did or didn't work.
Sure. You know, I see it all the time with elite level athletes, and this is something I think I'm not even sure as a coach what the right thing to do is, but they reach a point where they get so good, and as a coach, I start do I want to keep giving them more information and pushing them? Because, you know, I think especially in golf, you know, other sports I won't speak on because I'm not an expert in those fields, but in golf, people get so good, you can screw them up as fast as you can help them.
Right.
And you start, I don't want to call it complacency, but you get where maybe you go, boy, this person's so good, should I leave it alone and just keep kind of riding what we're doing? Or I've found elite, they want you pushing them all the time. I think any elite player I've coached now, when I start getting to that place of comfort where I go, well, hey, maybe this is really good and maybe we just need to focus on forever mastering the skill that I've given them, they get bored with me. And I think that, you know, as coaches, we have to find ways to challenge people. At the same time, I've found when I was playing coming up, you know, I saw some great players self-sabotage themselves that way, where in trying to improve, they got worse. What would you say if an elite player came to you? Where's the right balance there, if there is one, of, you know, how much do you keep pushing forward, like, hey, I could be better,
right.
And how much do you go, wow, my good's really good, maybe I should just master what I do when I'm doing it well? Because I think maybe that's the master skill in coaching high-level players.
Well, I think that you just hit it like the nail on the head, is that quantity isn't always better.
Sure.
Okay? More isn't always better. Sometimes doing what you already do well, but just finding a way to do it better and cleaning up the tiny details. Because you can't get good, you know, in the long run, I guess I say in a large quantity, until you master the tiny quantities.
Sure.
And so, and the fun part, though, is the higher up you go in the levels, the more you get to focus on those fine details.
Right.
You know, a lot of my conversations with some of our really high athletes with the Yankees has nothing to do with like, oh, well, what are you doing for your routine? No, their routine is great. It's how can we make your great routine even better?
Sure.
Because everybody's constantly reinventing themselves. Everybody's constantly improving. And so if you are being complacent and you stop, you can get passed up. Now,
Sure.
you have to have the wisdom also to know, where do I need to maintain my mastery? I would say that you don't always have to add or change or subtract, but sometimes you just have to change your intent going into it. So a lot of times maybe we get complacent because we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Well, then I'd challenge you to go do that same thing you already do, but focus on your intention and your purpose when you're out there.
Sure.
Being fully present in what you do and ramping up your intensity. Sometimes that's all you need, is
Right.
just to refocus even better when you're in it. It's not necessarily changing what you do, it's changing your focus to what you do.
So something I see all the time in younger players for certain, or even some tour pros that I coach, is we always feel technique's the answer, right? You know, I think as humans, it's almost how we protect ourselves. I know certainly during my own career, when things weren't going well, I'll get a new coach. I'll try a different swing. I'll ask this guy who I just played with that shot 65 what he's working on. Maybe that'll help me. I think a lot of really good players, I mean, we'll be working on technique forever. I'll be sitting in a wheelchair back there with all these kids I coach, still trying to help them get their swing good, but they have to learn how to win tournaments with what they're presently doing, because you're, as you said, as an elite athlete, you're going to perpetually be trying to improve. How can a young person avoid that trap?
Well, I think I've come across this before, and where it's kind of like, you know, I don't have a good game, and so all I'm going to do is I'm going to go hit balls for like 3 hours,
Sure.
like right after. And then, oh, well, I didn't hit well in the game, well, I'm going to go to the cages for 3 hours. And you just do the same thing over and over and over again, and you don't really get much better, but you don't also get much worse. It's kind
Sure.
of like wasted energy. And so people like that, I like to like simplify as much as possible, because we can overcomplicate things easily.
Sure.
And you cannot underestimate the power of simplicity. And so I'd simplify it back down to like 3 things that you really, if you do these 3 things, more often than not, you are going to be successful. Because when we start adding too much technique, we can add too many layers of difficulty. And that can cloud our mind. That can cloud our ability to really see things clearly when we're out there and really execute the things that we already know how to do.
Sure. I always try to convince students, when I've asked them to do what we want, that they do it at a high level, so that if they learn to do that all the time, well, they would just be good. You know, I think that goes back to your mastering a skill, you know, and getting really good at one thing. You know, when you look over time and you look at Jack Nicklaus as one example, and then we'll use Tiger Woods as the opposite, maybe arguably the 2 best players of all time. And Jack Nicklaus had one coach his whole life, and he did the same program and the same fundamentals his whole life. And then we've seen Tiger Woods with 4 or 5 different coaches, and he's won with all of them. And I think that speaks to that there's a lot of ways to be great.
Totally.
You know, I think Tiger always wanted to be challenged. I think maybe Jack, in a different time when there wasn't social media and YouTube and things like we're doing today, you know, was more content with, well, what I'm doing is winning tournaments, so why would I change? But I think that there's the commonality of the best players I've coached is that they own it themselves. You know, that they understand what they're doing and why it works. And I think as a coach, that's maybe our biggest job, is, you know, to help them to get to understand why what they're doing works for them, and when it's going well, what they're doing, and maybe some self-corrections when it's not. I think that's a huge skill, especially in our sport.
And I do want to make a note about that too, is because, you know, people have to take responsibility. Athletes have to take responsibility for how they show up every day, what they do every day.
Sure.
And where that's gotten them.
Right.
And that has nothing to do with the coach. That has nothing to do with the weather. That has nothing to do with anything outside of our control.
Sure.
You can control how you show up. So how are you interacting with people? You know, how is your attitude that day? And if, let's say you can't control your attitude, okay, how are you letting that affect the people around you? Or are you able to kind of, you know, I guess, put yourself to the side and just kind of like do your own thing? Sure. And then what you do every day, you know, are you showing up and are you half-assing what you're doing? Or are you giving it your all and walking out like, oh my gosh, I left nothing on the table? And then where that has gotten you, because those things all go into each other. And I think it's so often I see people like using blame, like, hey, oh, well, my coach didn't tell me to do that, so how was I supposed to know to do that? Or, you know, it's like, you guys are smart people. Sure. And so when you put blame or you give reasons outside of yourself as to why you can't do something, you've taken all of your power away, and you're avoiding what's really true. And so it's, when you avoid things, they come back around. They never go away. And so Carl Jung says this, and he says something about like, the things that you resist persist. And so when you're continuously like resisting or avoiding something that is a difficult thing, so let's say like you're avoiding like being honest with yourself, like I went out there and I did the very bare minimum, well, that's going to keep coming up until you actually face it and do something about it. And so the biggest thing is like athletes need to take responsibility for where they are, and to, instead of avoiding, they need to face it and own it.
Yeah, I think to me, you know, hard work, passion, determination, detail, I mean, those are the commonalities I see in the top players. I think talent's overused. You know, in our sport, everyone talks about talent as length. Every person I've ever heard tell me about someone with talent is someone who has speed. Now, I know speed is a important factor in a lot of sports, but I think the greatest talent I see in golf is mental talent. You know, the person who has the ability to be super detailed and take ownership of what they do and work hard on a consistent basis. Because I see a lot of kids, they'll be really into it for a month or 3 months or 6 months, and then they go away for a while, and they come back in, and they're kind of in and out, or their passion for the sport kind of hims and haws. I think that's normal to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But would you say that's a commonality in elite athletes? Passion, almost a love of just what they do or the pursuit of greatness. I think that's something I've seen with certainly the best players I've coached.
I definitely think that they know why they do what they do. And when you know why you do what you do, you have more power to do it. And so it's like they have a purpose greater than themselves. Whether it's, I want to be an inspiration to people around me, or I want to, provide for my family. When you know why you do what you do, it's nothing to stay late and do extra work. It takes nothing to like lock in when you know you should be locked in and you notice yourself kind of like drifting a little bit. And so I think passion is a huge one, and I think discipline is a huge one, because discipline, really what discipline is doing the things you really don't want to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody like stays late at a job because it makes them happy, right? Like nobody like works out extra in the gym because it's like, oh, this is where I want to be. Well, maybe there are some of those people, but I would say that for the majority, like that's not exactly what people want to do on their like Saturday night when they would rather be relaxing watching Netflix. You do that because you know that in the long run it's going to get you where you want to go. And that's the difference. I like to explain this between temporary comfort and long-term comfort. Temporary comfort is something like I snooze my alarm in the morning, and I finally got that sleep I wanted to get. Okay, that's good for right then, but did I get up and do the thing I really wanted to do? No, I didn't. I avoided it.
And that 10 minutes really give you that much more rest?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. But it's a temporary comfort.
Sure.
And then long-term comfort is something, it's different because you have to first experience discomfort. And so if you want the long-term comfort of being fit, you first have to go through the discomfort of going to the gym. If you want the comfort of being financially stable, you first have to go through the discomfort of being very, very stickler with what you spend your money on.
Sure.
And if you want to get to that next level, you want to get that college, D1 college scholarship, whatever that is, you have to first know, like, what are my strengths and weaknesses? What are the things I need to work on so I can get there? And so all that discomfort first has to be applied. And this, I've seen it a lot. So many people fall into the trap of temporary comfort. And instead of going after the difficult, instead of going after the discipline right then,
sure.
like right now.
Procrastination, right? It's
huge.
I remember Greg Norman wrote a great book kind of when his career was done, and it was how he became a great golfer and a great businessman and all this stuff. And I can't remember who it was, but he had a mentor, I believe, teach him when he was a young kid that as soon as the thought of procrastination crossed his mind, to do whatever he was going to procrastinate right then. Like literally right then, and he said that carried him through life. And he said, I can't tell you how important that was in his life, that every time the thought of procrastination came in his mind, he created a mental trigger. Whatever it was, he would do it right then. I think that, man, there's a lot of power in that, because I think we all tend to do those thoughts pop in our mind. Oh, I'll do that later, or my wife will tell me to take out the trash in the morning. Oh, I'll do that in 10 minutes. And I try to remind myself, no, just do it now. What's the difference? In 10 minutes, it's not going to be any different. I still got to walk to the curb.
Totally.
So I think that's a great skill.
Procrastination is only a temporary relief from stress.
Correct.
That's what procrastination is. And so, like, if you want that long-term thing, you have to do the thing in the short term that you don't want to do. And a lot of times, like, people don't do that. And so then James Clear in his book Atomic Habits, he actually talks about this, and he says your weight is a lagging measure of your eating habits. Your bank account is a lagging measure of your spending habits. And so whatever you do in the short term is eventually going to catch up to you in the long term.
So this was kind of my question I had a second ago, and I feel it's a huge motivator for me as a coach, which is in coaching young players, I'm constantly, I think, sharing with them things I think I would like to have done different. So what would Lauren Abarca at your age now tell Lauren Abarca at 10 years old when she was playing soccer? What would you do differently, or what are the lessons you've learned over time that you would do differently?
Oh, I would say one of the biggest ones is not to give weight to other people's opinions. I cared so much what other people thought. And I allowed that feeling of not feeling good enough, of not feeling like I could do it, I let that take grasp with my actions. And so my actions, I held myself back from doing the things I really wanted to do. Now, I'd say that there were some times I got through that.
Sure.
But man, I wish I would have adapted that back then. And the second one that kind of lends to that is self-talk. I wish I would have talked to myself more than listened to myself, because when we listen to ourselves, we hear all the negative. We hear all the things we can't do or why we shouldn't do it. It's our brain's default setting. But instead of that, I wish I would have told myself and combated that and been like, no, screw that. I can do this. Like, these are the things you have to do. It's going to be difficult. You know, it's certainly not going to be like a walk in the park, but I can do difficult things. And so I think those are the two biggest things. It's probably my self-talk and I guess the weight I gave to other people's opinions.
Okay, Lauren, so obviously I really appreciate all your time today. So talk to me a little bit about what you're doing going forward. What's the next step in your career? If people wanted some help from someone like you, where could they seek you out or where could they find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Lauren N. Abarca. And on there I have a link and I have my email. I have all sorts of stuff I'm working on, and so you can find me there.
That's great. That's great. Well, I certainly appreciate all your time today. For everyone who's watching this, if they have any other questions, hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah,
so
I'd
that'd be
love to.
really fun. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, you got it.